This is They Create Worlds, episode 213, the Exidy of the 80s and 90s.
If anybody wants to find me, I'll be in the last place you would look. In a place where people used to be, a land that's called reality, you'll find me there.
Welcome to They Create Worlds. I'm Jeffrey, and I'm joined by my co-host, Alex.
Hello.
You loved them in the 70s. Now they're back for round two with the 80s and 90s. It's everyone's favorite Ramtech offshoot, Exidy.
That's right. Kind of, in a way, completing a trilogy of company episodes here. They're not part one, part two, part three, but since Exidy did spin off from Ramtech, the last three episodes have been kind of linked. We got them through the vast majority of the 70s in the last episode, and now we'll take them on through to the end of the company, though most of the focus will be on the early to mid 1980s.
We left off with pretty good date with the 70s. They had some good, strong games, things like Circus. They're getting into programmable chips with the microprocessors and starting to make games that are precursor to things that we see in the future. They made brief forays into the computer space with computers that are made for businesses, with the Sorcerer. But some little thing called VisiCalc decided to say, oh yes, all you other computers out there, you shall bow down before our greatness, for we are VisiCalc, and we are an Apple exclusive. So, yeah.
And then IBM said, hold my beer. But that didn't do Exidy any good. That's right. So, yeah, like you said, Exidy's doing okay at the end of the 70s. The Sorcerer is a bit of a distraction that I don't think they need, but they've had some hits. They've never been the biggest company in the industry, but they've been present. They're known. Ever since Death Race made them somewhat infamous, they've definitely carved themselves out a place in the industry. But aside from the Sorcerer, which also was a distraction, like I said, that they didn't need, the industry was about to massively change. Space Invaders is coming. It's not so much that Space Invaders sucks all the oxygen out of the room, because obviously there are many fine games from many different companies that follow up on that. The problem is that the scale of the industry suddenly changes at that point. We're talking about games doing tens upon tens of thousands of units. We're talking about a constant need for one-upsmanship. We're talking about a move to a hits-driven business. Exidy, as we talked about in the last episode, is a very small company. It is not likely to get much bigger because Pete Kauffman, it appears, as we said last episode, we don't have as much insight as we really should on his thought process, but it's very clear just from looking at the historical record that Pete Kauffman really liked not being beholden to anybody. There was no investment in Exidy. There was no venture capital. There was certainly no desire to try to take the company public. It was Pete Kauffman's company. He would at times bring in other people to help manage the company, presidents serving under him, because there were times where, according to Hal Ivey, he really did want to get away from the day-to-day running of the business. He was never interested in giving up control. He was happy keeping the company small. That, I think, was a bit of a problem in a way as the whole industry got large. Now, obviously, Exidy is going to stick around to the 1990s, and it was still a somewhat viable concern even when it went out of business. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get there. That was enough for Pete Kauffman. He was happy to do his 10, 15, 20 million in sales a year, book a few millions of profits, and call it a day. But the industry that he was about to find himself in really wasn't conducive to that kind of thing, because you needed so much product in the pipeline. It was such a hits-driven business. There was such a demand for more, that a small business like that wasn't necessarily going to be completely viable. I just want to kind of set up the episode by talking about that, because we're going to see that Exidy makes a lot of interesting decisions, some good, some bad, over the course of the next few years. And I think that all of those decisions ultimately link back to this central idea that Exidy is very small Exidy has limited resources, and Pete Kauffman is in no way interested in making his company much bigger.
It's almost like they get eclipsed by everyone else when they're used to the 70s mindset of a couple thousand is considered a very good thing as opposed to, or even like 500, 800 is considered a good run.
Mm-hmm.
We're dealing with a shift and change of mindset where operators want 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100,000 of these cabinets. They want it this year. They want it next year. They want it the year after. They start wanting it every 8 months, every 6 months, every 4 months.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
At that point, even though you might think, hey, Exidy could just sit there and just be like, okay, they'll just sell out of everything because everything's so hot. If I am a person who wants to buy a video game, Exidy has 500, that's not even worth my time.
Mm-hmm. Sure, and just the volume of games they can put out as well, because basically it's getting to the point where you have to offer just a wide variety of games, or you have to offer something that's really special to stand out. Either way, whether you're going the I have something special route or the I am offering just a wide variety of things and flooding the market route, you need more people working on these games. You need more resources dedicated to these games. Exidy's going to have some hits in here, and we're going to talk about those hits. It's an okay time for the company, especially in the beginning when that rising tide really is lifting all boats, but they don't have the heft to be able to kind of force their way into the market. And so I think we are definitely going to see them get more and more overshadowed as time goes on. And then when the entire market goes south, it's both a blessing and a curse. They're in a bad situation to be able to assert themselves as a market leader. But on the other hand, they can weather the downturn a little better as well because they don't have the huge overhead. They don't have this giant apparatus that they've been feeding nonstop that is suddenly being starved all at once. So it's both a blessing and a curse. And we'll talk about both sides of that as the episode continues. But I definitely think it informs what they do, because we're going to see that Exidy, they're kind of a combination of Me Too products, but with a twist, a few innovative things here and there where they really feel like they can muscle in, and then just trying out different niches because they're never going to kind of be the leader in the field. And they're not trying to be the leader in the field, like I said. Kauffman is fine with making the small profits. He still does need to be able to turn a profit, even if a small one, and that gets more and more challenging for a small concern as this whole rise and fall of coin-operated video plays out in the late 70s and early 80s.
So what do they put out in the lead-up to the glory that is Space Invaders?
Indeed. I do think, and this is speculation of mine and also of Keith Smith, the author of All in Color for a Quarter, unpublished, though there's an old blog that's out there on the internet of his. As with any Golden Age and Bronze Age coin-operated video game stuff, a lot of what we talk about today owes a debt to his book, which is unpublished, but which he has given me a copy of. Both of us, are kind of the opinion that the Sorcerer was probably sucking up about all of the resources they had for a period of time, because Howell Ivey was basically the engineer and the programmer at Exidy. Now, he had help at times. We talked about Ed Velo, for instance, in the last episode, and they had technicians. There were other people hanging around, but he was the primary guy, and of course, he was front and center on all the work that they were doing on the Sorcerer in this time period. So I think in the immediate aftermath of the launch of the Sorcerer, they didn't have as much capability of their own to make games, because for a brief period here, they turn a lot of their attention outward to independent contractors and other companies in order to bring in their products for just a brief period here of a couple of years, I think, while the Sorcerer is really in full swing. But one of those games is also one of the most significant games that they release in this entire time period, which is a 1978 game, or at least debuted at the AMOA show in 1978, probably not out in the wild in big numbers until early 1979, called Starfire. So that's where we're going to start our examination today. Starfire was produced by Exidy, but it was not developed by Exidy. It was developed by an independent contractor going by the very appropriate name, quite frankly, considering how impressive this game was at the time, of Technical Magic. So we do need to spend a little time discussing technical magic because they're not worth an episode of their own, so this is as good a place as any to get them into the chronology of video game history here. Technical magic started life under the name Technical California, and was established by an electrical engineer by the name of Ted Michon. Ted Michon was a really talented electrical engineer that had been going to university studying electrical engineering at Caltech, when, as a job to kind of make ends meet, he ended up taking a job with a company called Comtal that was designing a new scanner system for the CIA to digitize their spy satellite photographs. So to clarify, this was right after he graduated from college, but he had been planning to go back because he graduated with the EE degree, but he was planning to go back for one more year, essentially as a super senior, in order to complete a second degree at the school. And then he got this summer job while he was waiting. I mean, he had committed and everything and been accepted by the school to come back, and took this job, this summer job with this company called Comtal, creating this scanner. That was a fairly successful project, but the company itself overall was not doing very well, and so then he needed another job to make ends meet. He'd kind of, I think by this point, had a good taste of the working world and decided he didn't really need to go back to school for that second degree anymore, and was looking around in the LA Times Want ads for another job. He spotted an opening for an electrical engineer at a company called Digital Games. We probably talked about Digital Games in our Cocktail Pong episode because they were one of the many companies that was deeply involved in that. If we didn't, that's fine. I'm still not talking about them now. That'll have to wait for some other time. Suffice it to say, Digital Games was a very small player in the industry that had basically hit it big with the Cocktail Pong thing. Rode that to some success and some expansion, but really had no idea what they were doing in the industry, according to Michon. They didn't know the business. They didn't know the engineering. Like, there was one other engineer there when he was hired. That guy really didn't know what he was doing. They basically lucked into Pong, like so many other companies did in this time period. The company was kind of rocky. He did some work for them. The company ended up going bankrupt, but they kind of spun into a second company called Micronetics that was basically the exact same company, except on paper, corporate shenanigans. Old company, bankrupt, but here's a new company that is in no way the old company, I promise. So he worked at Digital Games / Micronetics for a little bit, but then Micronetics failed as well. So he ended up on his own, and he founded Technical to be kind of an independent contractor. He was kind of at a loss on what to do. I mean, he wasn't necessarily going to be in video games. He was certainly going to be in electrical engineering, hardware engineering of some kind. But it wasn't necessarily going to be that. He wasn't exactly sure how this was going to work. He established the company in roughly the summer of 1977, according to Keith's research. Kind of thought he would do video games, but the problem was he didn't have any staff. It was just him. So he ended up connecting with a couple more former Caltech classmates who were in the process of designing a terminal for Ito, a Japanese trading company. They were good engineers, didn't know what they were doing in business. Michon had a company, so they kind of all banded together to do this terminal project, and that's at the point that the company's name was changed to Technical Magic as well. So once that project was under their belt and they had some idea of what they were doing, Michon turned his attention to his video game aspirations. And of course, by this time, a little movie by the name of Star Wars had come out.
That would go nowhere.
Yes, certainly not. Michon was blown away by Star Wars, as were so many of the nerdy folk at the time, and even non-nerdy folk, but especially the nerdy folk. So he decided, I am going to make a video game based on that. So that's what he started to do, and he decided that he wanted this to be a truly state-of-the-art video game. He did know some programming, but he was primarily a hardware guy, so he starts building out the hardware on this. Z80 microprocessor, which is considered the creme de la creme of 8-bit processors at the time, a full color bitmap display. at a time when color was extremely rare. We talked about that when we talked about Car Polo, the Exidy game last time. Incredibly rare, mostly because it takes so much more video memory, because you need more bits per pixel to do color than you do black and white. That's just math. Not only full bitmapped color graphics, but an actual color monitor within the system as well. Because we talked about how earlier games like Car Polo were using the old approach of get as cheap a color TV as you can. I mean, all color TVs were somewhat expensive in the 1970s, but get as cheap a color TV as you can, rip out the TV tuner, and transform it into a monitor to kind of get your effect. I mean, it does the job, but it's not quite as nice as a bespoke monitor. He found somewhere a cheap enough, I'm sure it wasn't cheap, but a cheap enough source of color monitors, and had this really great hardware system. But he wasn't a programmer. Well, he was a programmer. I mean, I take that back. He could program, but his expertise was hardware engineering, and we're to the period of time where it's getting pretty hard for one person to do everything. So he needs a programmer. So he connects with yet another Caltech student by the name of David Rolfe, who we have talked about in the context of the Intellivision, because he was very important in the development of some of the early Intellivision software, including the operating system, the exec of the Intellivision. That's no coincidence. This is all linked because Caltech is in Southern California, Mattel is in Southern California, and a lot of Caltech students were connecting with each other. Students and former students were connecting with each other, forming small companies. We talked about APH in the context of the Intellivision. It's no coincidence that you have all of this kind of bubbling in Southern California. So he connects with David Rolfe. David Rolfe joins the company in late 77 to do the programming on the game. And then Ted's girlfriend, who later becomes his wife, Susan, does the art, does the graphics for the game. So those are the primary three individuals that create this game, Starfire. It's really quite remarkable for the time. They had to be clever and use some tricks in order to actually make full color viable, just because of how much memory that takes and the expense. The graphics are very much wireframe graphics. Now, they're still raster. It is a bitmapped display. It is not a vector display. But the objects are all wireframe objects because they don't want to be putting up full color everywhere all the time. There's definitely also some tricks. I mean, I'm not a technical person, but there's definitely some tricks about different zones of color and whatnot. So you get some color clash sometimes between the white stars in the background and the various other objects on the screen because they're being very judicious in the way they do color to cut down on the video memory. It's a first-person game. There'd been a couple of those before, like Atari Starship 1, so that wasn't entirely a new concept, but full color was pretty new. Also, the enemy ships actually did shoot back at you, which was a very rare thing at the time. It was kind of half in the old world, half in the new world. I mean, obviously, Space Invaders changes everything, and Space Invaders is coming out at about the same time as Starfire. Space Invaders changes everything with its 3 lives and much more danger and whatnot. This is still stuck in the old days of kind of timed play, similar to other target shooting games like Seawolf and M79 Ambush that we've talked about in other episodes. It's still a score-chasing game with a timer, but the timer in this case is a fuel gauge that is counting down as you are shooting at targets. And if you get hit by the enemy, who's not firing constantly, it's not as intense as later first-person games would be in this regard. But if you did get hit by an enemy shot, it would not kill you, but it would take away some of your fuel. So it would make your timer run down faster. And of course, the idea is to kill as many things, score as many points as you can. Those enemies, of course, are ships that look very suspiciously like TIE fighters, but are, of course, not called that for legal reasons.
And Imperial Star Destroyers.
Yes, because the entire inspiration for this game was, of course, Star Wars, as should come as no surprise. It was a really advanced game at the time. Their original contract for it was not with Exidy, but was actually with Midway Manufacturing, who had a history of working with outside companies like Dave Nutting Associates and Arcade Engineering and whatnot. They signed a development deal with Midway, and they were working on this game, and for whatever reason, it just did not satisfy Midway management. There was always something wrong with it. What that was would change over time. They didn't like the speed of the game. They didn't like the number of targets. They didn't like the difficulty, whatever. I mean, they were never satisfied with it. They had them constantly tweaking it. And every time they would tweak it and come back and say, is this good? They'd be like, no. Then on top of all of that, for some reason, Hank Ross, the co-founder of Midway, who was at this point mostly retired but still served as a consultant for Midway and was often around the office, made the suggestion that they add a witch into the game, Wizard of Oz style, that would randomly fly across the screen and you could shoot the witch for bonus points. Yes, this game is set in space with TIE fighters at this point. It's not like the setting was different at this time. Yes, we're talking about adding a witch to a game in space.
If you're going to believe in magic anyway, why can't they just have a nice little thing that says, I generate air around me?
Absolutely. So they added the witch in, and the witch functioned very similar to like the flying saucers in Space Invaders, where, you know, the witch would fly across the screen and wouldn't attack you. It would just fly across the screen, and if you managed to hit it, you got even more points. But even with the witch, it was a no-go. They just didn't want the game. So they finally said, we're not going to take it. Gave it back to them to shop around elsewhere. And they ended up connecting with Exidy. And Exidy was thrilled by the game. Now, I'm sure in part that's because they were a bit desperate for product at this point, because all their attention was on the Sorcerer. But, I mean, it really is a solid game. So they did make a few last adjustments for it at Exidy, one of which was to change out the witch, which just didn't make sense, for an Exidy spaceship. It had the Exidy logo on it. That became the new bonus thing. Still worked the same way, and in fact, in the code, it's still referred to as a witch. But they got rid of that incongruity of there being a witch in there for some reason. Exidy was very impressed by it, and they wanted a special presentation for this game. And so their industrial engineer, their cabinet designer, Michael Cooper Hart, actually built a fully enclosed cockpit cabinet. Well, I say fully enclosed. I mean, the sides were somewhat open, I think. But an enclosed cockpit-style cabinet for this game with a big 8-inch speaker in the seat that you sat in inside to give this great thrumming effect to the sound. This was the first, as far as we know, and this is a first that seems to hold up pretty well, so I think it may continue to be first. This was the first environmental style, cockpit style cabinet that was ever created for a video game. There had been others that you sat down at before this, but none that also had like the enclosure up above you and to the sides of you as well. This kind of environmental cabinet like that. That was one interesting thing about it. The other interesting thing about it is that as they were going through all of this nonsense with Midway, making all of these tweaks, and nothing was working, Michon and Rolf got to thinking to themselves, they're trying to think of anything they can to make this game stand out, to make this game have appeal, to make Midway just say yes to the bloody thing. As part of their analysis of that, they were thinking about what do players really want? Not just necessarily from a video game, but just like much more existentially than that. What do players really want? Something that they came up with just in this brainstorming is that players like to be remembered. People like to be remembered. You know, just in general, people like to think that they've left something behind. Most people do. That got them to thinking, well, why don't we let people enter their initials next to their score and have a table of scores that shows the top scores on the game with each player's initials next to them. That's what they did, and Starfire is indeed, and I am as confident as I can be about this one, because we have done the research on this because this is such a monumental thing in the history of video arcade games. I am pretty darn confident that this was the very first game to have both that score table and to have that ability for you to enter your initials or whatever three-letter combination you want to next to your score and have that be recorded for posterity. There had been games with high scores before, like Seawolf and M79 Ambush, and of course Space Invaders itself coming out at about the same time. But all of those just had a single high score. Even Space Invaders, which was the game that really inaugurated the whole concept of score chasing, it just has the one high score at the top of the screen with no identifying characteristics next to it. Very soon after Starfire, Asteroids would come along, and as far as we know, Ed Logg was inspired by Starfire to do his high score table. I think Space Invaders Part 2 allowed the high score winner to, put their initials next to the high score. Asteroids had a high score table, but that was all after Starfire. Starfire seems to have been the very first one, and this was such a game-changing feature for arcades because it fostered that sense of competition and community that would keep players coming back and feeding more quarters into machines for the privilege of seeing their name on that high score table, and not only doing so at their local arcade, but once they would top out at their local arcade, even traveling to other arcades to see if they could start marking other territories with their initials as well. I mean, a big part of the golden age of arcade games is score-chasing culture. Obviously, Space Invaders and Asteroids and some of the others were the big games that drove that. But Starfire plays its little role in that history as well by giving us the high score table with the 3-letter initials next to each score.
Not only does it do that, but it gives you 20 slots, which is pretty rare, even in more modern games. Usually it's the top 10.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Looking through the game here and some of the gameplay, you have Starfire with this suspiciously Star Warsian font.
Yes.
If you've seen Star Wars and the font at the beginning, this looks just like it, except it's red and it says Starfire. Totally not a ripoff.
No, of course not.
Then you fight these wonderful TIE fighters. Oh, wait. Starfighters. That are actually very well done, very detailed, and very pretty. I wouldn't be surprised with how they did this thing, because if you skip around in the video, you see how the enemies are. They are just a single color wireframe. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't be surprised that they just have some small way that they change out what the color is, that they change it to. And then as far as what goes to video is whatever the color is set to. Mm-hmm. That kind of simplistic color that really drives it home. You got a very basic status bar at the bottom with the fuel gauge and then your laser things. You have to wait for it to charge up before you fire. What's really neat is that it does do a reticle thing that comes into play when you get really close to getting onto target. Mm-hmm. And it will actually have an arrow in the X and Y plane. What you want to do is get those in roughly the center of both of them and then fire so that you can get a direct hit.
I think that was partially inspired by Star Wars, too. Now, the graphic does not imitate the graphic in Star Wars. I mean, it doesn't look exactly like it. We can remember that in the pursuit scene, when the Millennium Falcon is leaving the Death Star pursued by 4 TIE fighters, you have Han and Luke in the gun turrets, and they have these little targeting things where they're trying to line up the fighter inside this kind of targeting grid. Like I said, that grid looks different, but I have to imagine that that's kind of where the inspiration for that came from as well.
What gives more credence to the fact that they just have 3 colors set for the background and characters is that reticule changes color based off of whatever the bad guys are.
Yep.
That really makes me think that that's the case, that they're really using like 3 bits for the video and they're cheesing it by saying the 3rd bit color is this other register that we change randomly to whatever we want.
Like I said, I'm not technical, but I'm sure there's some kind of trick like that. I mean, it's definitely not a bitmap screen where they have full control of each individual pixel to turn to any color they want, because that would have been way too prohibitively expensive in 78, 79.
It's an interesting game. You're just fighting and shooting up a bunch of TIE fighters, going around until you run out of fuel. The Exidy spaceships kind of look like Imperial Star Destroyers. That's pretty much it. I do have some pictures I was able to pull up of the case and how that looks. I will, of course, throw all that in the show notes, along with, hopefully, I'll be able to find a video of someone actually showing off the case in person.
Absolutely. So yeah, that's Starfire, and Starfire was a big hit. We never know exactly how most of these things go in the coin-op world, but we do have the popularity charts in the trades. Playmeter considered Starfire the number 3, the 3rd most popular game of 1979. Replay, it was listed a little lower at number 7, but either way, it was a top 10 game in 1979. Now, these are the popularity charts. Popularity does not equate sales figures, because the way these popularity charts work is Replay and Playmeter magazine, they poll operators and ask operators which of their games seem to be getting the most play. And then operators answer that back, and that's how they make these charts. So these are not sales charts. It's highly unlikely it was the 3rd best or 7th best selling game of the year. in terms of number of units sold. There's no way that Exidy was pumping out the tens of thousands of units that companies like Midway and Atari were pumping out. But in terms of popularity with operators that had it installed in their arcades, it was considered to be one of the great earners on location for the year 1979. As I said, directly inspired Asteroids to have the high score table, and then Asteroids sells tens of thousands of units, and the high score table takes root in consciousness. So a significant game, both in terms of its popularity and in terms of its innovations and influence. There really wasn't much else going on, though, at Exidy at this time. When it debuted at the 1978 AMOA, it debuted just alongside a couple of completely forgettable clones that I'm only going to name check here just because. A game called Ripcord, which was literally just a clone of an Atari game called Skydiver, where you have to guide the parachutist down to a target, landing safely, and a game called Crash that was just a clone of Head On. Everyone was doing Head On clones at the time, as we've talked about in other episodes, because Head On was a very popular game. I think at this time, most of the attention internally was on the Sorcerer and getting that up and running. So there wasn't a lot of time to do much of anything interesting in-house. Starfire, of course, coming from out-of-house. So yeah, that was 78 and into 79, premiered in 78 into 79. 79 itself, they really didn't have a lot of great follow-up after Starfire over the next year. They had a combination of some more Tech Magic stuff and some more licensed stuff that came out in this time period. Probably the most notable thing is they actually licensed a game from Nintendo, the Nintendo arcade game Sheriff, which Exidy released as Bandito, which had art by a young Shigeru Miyamoto and was a game where you are a cowboyish sheriff in the middle of the screen, and arrayed all around the edge of the screen are all of these bandits, and they come in from the side and attack you, and you have to kill them all before they kill you. That's really a Nintendo game, not an Exidy game, but it's just interesting that they actually did a license of that. The big game at the 1979 AMOA, the game that I think they were hoping was going to be big, was Technical Magic's follow-up to Starfire, which was a game called Fire 1. Fire 1 was meant to kind of be the ultimate expression of the Midway game Seawolf. We've talked about Seawolf in our Dave Nutting Associates episode, some of our other 70s arcade episodes. Seawolf was a target shooting game with a submarine that was one of the absolute biggest hits of the entire 1970s. Several companies, after Seawolf was released in 1976, released their own kind of spins and variations on this, some of which were more successful than others. Ted Michon really wanted to take this concept in the most realistic and intense direction that he possibly could. The original Seawolf, popular as it was a very simple game. You peer through a periscope, there are targets moving at various speeds, and you're just shooting torpedoes up from the bottom of the screen to try to hit targets that are worth various points. It's a timer game, there's nothing shooting back at you. It was thrilling for its day, but this is a post-Starfire, post-Space Invaders world. It's really no longer thrilling for 1979. Michon decided to create a game with a little bit more strategy and a little bit more danger to it. So the first thing he did is he made it two-player. But to preserve the kind of fog of war of submarine combat without the expense of a second monitor, which would have been very expensive, he divided the screen in half, a single screen in half. There was a divider in the middle there. So each player was only looking at half the screen, which was their play area, which was only half a screen in size. Then he further divided this because he wanted a little more of that cat and mouse of a submarine kind of thing. So there were two objectives in the game. You could win the game either by destroying the opponent's submarine, which, again, could be a second player playing right next to you but not being able to see what you're doing. Or each player had a fleet on the surface that they were trying to protect from the submarines. So you could also win by destroying all of the ships on the surface that the other player was trying to protect. So there was a multi-view to this. So there was an overarching radar view of the entire screen that gave you an idea of where all the ships were located. But then you had a much more zoomed in segment of the screen, which is what you were actually controlling, your submarine, and you could dive up and down to different depths. You could shoot at things. You had some ammo limitations that you had to keep track of, which was also another section of the screen. So there was a lot more strategy, a lot more sophistication, and definitely a lot more tension and a lot more of a cat and mouse feel that seemed very appropriate to submarine warfare. In theory, that is all very interesting and fascinating. In practice, the game did not do great. No one can necessarily say why that is, because there was not sophisticated market research being done on coin-operated games back then. It's not like they were going out to the players and saying, like, why did you hate it? Atari was doing some of that at this time, but little old Exidy certainly wasn't. The opinions of people like David Rolfe, that worked on the game, is that it was probably just, it was too complicated. There were too many things going on. It had too steep a learning curve, and people weren't interested in investing the time because it is very complicated, having 3 different segments of the screen that you have to keep track of and lots of stuff going on. Obviously, as the Golden Age progresses, games get more and more difficult, like, say, Defender, which has some of the same thing going on, but it's a learning curve, and you can't just go straight to the super hardest difficulty right at the beginning. You need some time for players to acclimate to that, and it seems like this one probably dialed it up to 11 a little too fast, and actually was not a success, but it's a very interesting game nonetheless, and definitely worth mentioning here.
I like it. It looks interesting. With the radar map, you can see in the video here that you got that left and right thing split. And you can look at what's in red on the radar map is actually the bad guys. Your ships are in white. But you actually see the reverse of that if you look at the other side of the screen. Mm-hmm. So you get an idea of where things are. Your ammo is kept track of in the middle, along with your health bar and some other stuff. Then you have your play area down below where you're seeing, like, oh, here's this ship, here's that ship, fire at this, fire at that. Oh no, I see the enemy sub. Shoot at it, shoot at it.
So I don't know exactly what you're looking at, but if you're just looking at a screenshot, you can't actually see the other player's screen. There is a divider. They have actually literally divided the screen in half, and in the actual cabinet, there is a divider that prevents you from seeing the other player's screen.
Right, so I'm looking at a MAME emulation of it, so obviously I'm seeing both sides.
Right.
The cabinet art for this, as far as the actual cabinet itself, you got a regular-sized cabinet, exactly like you expect it to be, but literally in the middle of it, going about halfway out from about roughly equal to that of the Marti, so that you're not seeing out of your corner of your eye, is a divider that splits the left and right screen.
Yep.
So you can have one person on the left, one person standing on the right, and just sort of crowd yourself in there to block the other guy from glancing over. It's passable. You're not going to be spied on.
Yeah, kind of an ingenious way to do that kind of fog of war at a time when doing a cabinet with 2 monitors would have just been way too prohibitively expensive. Couldn't throw 2 monitors in, so he literally divided the play area in half in that way instead. So an interesting game, but not necessarily so successful. Another thing that they did at this time, vector graphics games were starting to become the new hotness at this time as well, which we talked about. We did an episode on vector games after Cinematronics' Space Wars had come out and set the arcade on fire in 1978. Exidy, I don't think really they didn't have the staff to be able to come up with their own vector system. But I imagine Pete Kauffman still wanted to chase this new vector area as well, because it was an interesting new area in video games. So they ended up purchasing a subsidiary of Cinematronics called Vector Beam. There are tons of corporate shenanigans around why Vector Beam exists, why Cinematronics ended up buying it, and why then Cinematronics ends up selling it. And at some point, we will do a Cinematronics episode or 2. And before that, I am of the hope that Ethan Johnson, a friend of the show, will get his book on Gremlin Industries and Cinematronics published, which will go into all of those corporate shenanigans. I'm not going to go into that here. We don't have time in the context of Exidy. But suffice it to say, they did buy Vector Beam on December 1st, 1979 from Cinematronics, which came along with it the rights to use that vector hardware system that Cinematronics/Vector Beam had patents on, and allowed them to get into this space without developing their own hardware. They rather bizarrely name Vector Beam Exidy 2. Like, they keep it going briefly as a subsidiary with the name Exidy 2. They release, as far as I know, only one game under this label, which is Tail Gunner 2, which is actually just the Vector Beam game Tail Gunner, but in an enclosed cockpit-style cabinet like Starfire. Like, it's not actually a sequel. They didn't change the gameplay. It's the exact same gameplay as Vector Beam's Tail Gunner, Vector Beam/Animatronics Tail Gunner, just in an enclosed cocktail cabinet. But they called it Tail Gunner 2 to distinguish. The only game they released under that banner of Exidy 2. The Vector thing didn't really work out for them. But it just goes to show that Pete's trying to find ways to keep up with the times in the business, but oftentimes he has to cut corners or do it on the cheap to do so because Exidy is such a small company. And that's what I think is going on here with the Vector Beam purchase, is how can we get into Vector without really doing Vector? It's like, well, Vector Beam's available, I imagine, for cheap. I mean, I don't have a sales price for it, but knowing the whole history there, probably for cheap. So we'll just snap that up and get a Vector graphic system that way. Though they never really do much with it after that. That's kind of closing out the 70s. You know, they have one big hit at the end of the 70s with Starfire, one relatively big hit, and then a lot of kind of also-rans. Meanwhile, the whole Sorcerer thing is not going well after VisiCalc and all that. I mean, we talked about that last episode. It has a little success in, like, the Netherlands and Australia, but it's really not going to have much of a future. They do one kind of interesting game in 1980. It's not the only game they do in 1980, but like there's just one interesting game in 1980. That is a game called Targ, T-A-R-G, which is short for Target. It's a kind of simple target shooting game. It's taking some of the gameplay of like a tank or one of those old one-on-one dueling games where you're in a maze and have to chase down your opponent, except instead of being a one-on-one dueling game like a tank, it's a one-player target shooting game where you're having to move around this grid of blocks that represent a city and destroy enemy ships. It was a minor hit, very minor hit. I'm not going to go into much detail on it, but it's worth mentioning just because it did sneak onto the charts a little bit. Some people do fondly remember it. So they get Targ out. But really, the 79-80 period is not very remarkable for them as this whole Sorcerer thing is playing out, and they don't have a lot of resources shifted to games. There was, however, a good thing that came out of the whole Sorcerer kerfluffle, because it was in this time period that they realized that they really did not have enough staff to do everything that they needed to do in coin-operated games, and they start building up the company a little bit. It's still going to be a small company. They're not building it up much, but they build it up a little bit because, you know, Hal Ivey has kind of been the one-man band. Like I said, people like Ed Valo helped on individual projects. In a lot of ways, it had been a one-man band. We were not in an era anymore where one person, even if they had the skills to do both the hardware and the programming, we were in an era where you really couldn't have one person do it all and get a game out in any reasonable kind of time frame. They decide to start putting together a programming team. Hal Ivey is going to be the principal hardware engineer. He's the VP of engineering, and he's going to continue to be the principal designer of all the hardware. But they're actually going to establish a programming team to work on the games as well. The key people that they source for the programming team in the beginning are all people that come out of the Sorcerer project in one way or another. One of those is a guy by the name of Larry Hutcherson. Hutcherson has actually been with the company since 1974, but he just started out as a part-time job on the line, you know, building games, and then he ended up over time running manufacturing for the company. He was their operations guy. Then he left the company very briefly in 1978 to go someplace else, and then came back to the company as the head of sales. He was on sales operations. He had nothing to do with the creation of the games themselves. However, he did know some programming. Back in the day when he was in school, he had done some programming in Fortran on mainframes. He didn't like it, which is why that wasn't the work he was doing, because, you know, this was batch processing, very non-interactive programming, so it wasn't something that sparked his imagination at the time. But he did have a little bit of technical understanding. He did have a little bit of that training. In his capacity as doing operations, he actually took some sorcerers and repurposed them to automate portions of the manufacturing line. I don't know exactly how. I don't know the details. But the point is, he took sorcerers and was using them in his job, and that impressed the people at Exidy, and they realized that he had some skill with computers and with programming, and so they were like, hey, you want to program games? And he was like, sure, that sounds fun. So this guy who had been their head of operations and then their head of sales became a game designer and programmer because of what he did with the sorcerer. The other one, and the most important of these, was the guy that ended up leading the new programming group at Exidy by the name of Vic Tolomei. Vic Tolomei had been exposed to computers in high school. The common story in this time period of school gets a computer or a terminal. In this case, it was a computer. It was like a really old IBM 1620, like a dinosaur, even at the time the school got it. But the 1620 computer, and learned how to program, fell in love with programming, went to school to study programming, in his case at UCLA, where he worked on an IBM 360 mainframe. Really had an aptitude for programming, so much so that while he was still a student, he was also serving as an instructor in computer programming and lower-level computer courses. One of these guys really good at programming, knows what he's doing. After graduating from UCLA, he stayed at UCLA to work with the university's mainframe, so he had a job there. Loved working with computers, but didn't feel like institutional programming, mainframe programming, was the way the industry was headed. Spoiler alert, he was right. So decided that he really didn't want to stay at UCLA and do that over time. He wanted to somehow crack into this burgeoning new microcomputer field that looked so exciting. He ended up purchasing an Exidy Sorcerer. As was the case with a lot of these early computers, there was really not a lot of documentation on the Sorcerer available. You know, Exidy had put the computer out, but at the beginning there wasn't a lot of documentation on how it worked. Part of that, I think, is because they were trying to kind of sell some of their like prepackaged stuff. They didn't necessarily want people poking around too carefully in the system. They kind of wanted to retain control of the environment, I think. So he reverse engineered the OS of the Sorcerer and wrote his own book on how the OS worked and how the computer worked. You know, had that published to make money off of it. Of course, word of this gets back to the Exidy people, and Paul Terrell, who we may recall from the previous episode, is kind of the person who came up with this whole Sorcerer idea and brought it to Exidy and is running that stuff out of Exidy at this time, calls him up and was like, who leaked this information to you? Who leaked our OS to you? He was like, no, I just reverse engineered it. Paul Terrell was like, oh, you want to come up and talk to us? So he got a job in the Sorcerer division, the data products division or whatever it was, working on software and peripherals and whatnot for the Sorcerer computer. So he did that for a little bit until the Sorcerer stuff was starting to wind down and they were starting to think about expanding the video game stuff, you know, the arcade game stuff again. And then they were like, you know, we're putting together a programming team for our arcade games, coin-operated games, and we'd like you to run it. He was like, okay. So he became the head of the programming group, hired another couple of people, and also did programming himself. Vic Tolomei was responsible for one of the more interesting games that Exidy released in this period, and one of their bigger hits as well, though not as big a hit as Starfire, I don't think, which was the game Venture. Venture is very interesting because it's kind of a proto-gauntlet. It's definitely a proto-dungeon crawler kind of game, and none of those things are accidents. Because one thing about Vic Tolomei, in addition to his programming background, is that he was also an early and ardent fan of Dungeons and Dragons. When he was at UCLA, he was part of a group of other computer programmers, computer people at the university that were playing D&D regularly. He and a friend of his named Don Worth actually got together and decided to build their own dungeon to run players through as kind of a competition kind of thing. It's kind of similar to Rogue and some of the early computer RPGs, except we're not talking about a computer game. We're talking about pen and paper D&D, but with a really large dungeon. And rather than just having a group of players where we're like, okay, this is today's adventure, we're going to run through this dungeon, having it be here's a dungeon, we're going to run multiple groups of players through this over time, and people will essentially be competing to see who can get the most treasure or who can get through the whole dungeon the fastest, etc., making it almost like a computer game kind of dungeon crawl, which I suppose makes sense since this is a couple of computer programmers turning their attention to doing a D&D module, essentially. They based it on Tolkien and the Mines of Moria. It was this 20-level dungeon. Everything was pre-generated. It was not random. They built 20 levels of this thing on individual big sheets of graph paper, and then they had tables of encounters and treasures and all of this other stuff that you would encounter, traps, etc., that you would encounter on each level of this dungeon as you move between corridors and rooms in each level of this dungeon. Very similar to a rogue kind of experience. And they actually used the computer at UCLA to help them generate a lot of these tables. So the game was entirely pen and paper. It wasn't a computer game, but they did use their computer to help them make their game by helping to generate these charts and tables that they were using to keep track of everything. So the really fascinating thing is here that some of you will have already cottoned on to this if you know some of the history. When I said Don Worth went on to create the game Beneath Apple Manor, which was essentially Rogue before Rogue. Clearly inspired by this Dungeons & Dragons game that he and Vic Tolomei did together. So that's one branch that comes out of this. Vic Tolomei then goes on to Exidy and creates a more arcade action game-like version of this called Venture, where you have to explore the rooms of a dungeon and gather treasures while avoiding traps and killing enemies. I think it's only 3 levels, and then they repeat ad nauseum, faster and more difficult. Basically, you have a series of corridors that link a small number of rooms, and you have to navigate to the rooms. Now, these corridors are inhabited by these invincible monsters. You can't kill them, and if they touch you, they kill you. So this part of it is almost like a maze game beginning to it, in the sense that you have to move around these corridors and avoiding these enemies. Then once you hit a room, that room could have some traps in them, could have some treasures in them, and can have some enemies in them. These enemies you actually can kill, the ones in the rooms. So you have to avoid or kill the enemies, avoid the traps, and gather the treasures from all the rooms to move on to the next level. But just like Berserk and certain other games of this type, to make sure that you're not just sitting there and going really slowly, because of course coin op is all about how many coins you put in it through, per minute. One of those invincible monsters from the hallway will eventually come into the room and pursue you, similar to Evil Otto in Berserk, to make sure that you clear the room quickly and don't just loiter around too long to keep those coins dropping in. So that's Venture, a Dungeons & Dragons inspired game inspired by, in large part, by Ptolemy's own dungeon creation experiences while he was at UCLA.
This game is very interesting. Just like you said, it has a lot of the same concept that they had before with the full color thing, where they have a certain color palette that is switched out between levels that changes what the wall colors are going to be. The monsters look almost like little squid monsters, Cthulhu-esque monsters that will come after you and will definitely eat your face. You move very quickly when you're going between the corridors, trying to go into the rooms. There's little doors, and you see little white doors that you go into. You go into the room, and then it blows up, and you get to see the inside of the room, and there's usually a treasure, something in there, not to mention some monsters, and then you just shoot them up a la Gauntlet.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually pretty clever and pretty neat. I can certainly see a lot of people really getting sucked into this and this thing really eating quarters and then failing.
The other very interesting thing about it is that for a 1981 game, it has really good music and sound effects. Like, really, really good.
This music's really good. They have to have multiple voices going on, at least 4. The sound effects are really neat. They seem to have unique ones for different traps and different things that are going on. They change the music as you enter the room versus when you're on the outside.
The reason for that is they had an old coin-op hand by the name of Ed Anderson on their staff at that time, who had bounced around several other companies, including Chicago Coin, which we may recall from the last episode was the company that kind of inadvertently screwed over Exidy in the 70s. Ed Anderson, in addition to all the coin-op sales and marketing stuff he was doing or whatever, was actually a trained and accomplished musician. So, in the early days of video games, some Exidy games had some music in them, but in the early days of video games, you usually just had a little bit of music in between rounds, or, it might be a little ditty, and it would always be something public domain. It would not be something particularly interesting, and it would just be some bleeps and bloops. And Ed Anderson had heard some of this, and he was like, why are we doing this stuff? I can put so much better music in your games. And so Pete Kauffman didn't realize that he was a musician. He's like, oh, you can do music? At the time, another side business that Exidy had at this time, and I have no idea why, is they were selling coin-operated player pianos. Because why not? I mean, I think this goes back to the whole thing that I said where I think Pete Kauffman, because he knew he couldn't always compete pound for pound against other companies, was looking for niches where nobody else was to see if he could accomplish something in a niche. I assume that's why he did coin-operated player pianos, but I have no information on their coin-operated player piano business other than that it existed. But anyway, so they're in the showroom, so Ed Anderson just sits down at one of these coin-operated player pianos and just starts playing the piano himself, because he's an accomplished musician. And so Pete's like, okay, fine, you can do some music. Ed Anderson did the music for Venture, and it is one of the very early real video game soundtracks. It's not the very first, but it is one of the very early ones, and certainly an incredible rarity outside of Japan, because when you think of most of the classic soundtracks from the early 80s in the arcade, you think of Japanese games, but this, of course, is an American one. So that's the other thing that's interesting about Venture. It's groundbreaking in a lot of ways. Exidy is never going to have your biggest hit on the market in this time period, but they're always trying to do something interesting because that's the way they stand out. They're not going to beat you on volume. They're not going to beat you on quantity. So what they're really trying to do, I think, is find niches that they can go into, even if some of them are a little silly, like the player piano thing, or just really pushing the envelope with the games they decide to do, like Starfire, which was developed externally, but Exidy took the chance on manufacturing it. And then Venture here, primarily driven by Vic Tolomei, which was just so innovative in so many different ways. And again, a minor hit. Like, they'll have minor hits. Starfire was a pretty major hit, but Targ was a minor hit in 1980. Venture and another game called Spectar, that was basically a sequel to Targ, were minor hits in 1981. But they don't have the big hits. The days when they can have one of the largest games in the industry, like when Circus was one of the biggest hits in the industry a few years ago, those days are gone. They have just enough minor hits to keep them moving forward, and they're doing some innovative things in the meantime. That takes us to their 1982 output. Again, we're not mentioning here, of course, every game they ever released. We're just trying to keep it to the most interesting, the most remarkable. 1982 was definitely a year of copycats, but they were doing a lot of copycats with a twist. Kind of one of the main people that take center stage in that in this year is Larry Hutcherson, who creates their two bigger games of the year. Again, not humongous hits, but they're kind of minor hits of the year. One of those is a game that has the completely nonsensical name of Pepper 2. There is no Pepper 1. It's just called Pepper 2. There is a kind of funny story about the name that Larry Hutcherson has told to Keith Smith in an email interview. Pepper 2 is very much like the Konami game Amidar, a maze game with a little bit of the Taito game Kicks thrown in just for kicks. I'm so funny. Where you're zipping around in a maze, like in Amidar, and as you zip around on this maze and complete squares, you're changing the color of territory and you're capturing territory, similar to a game like Kicks as well, in order to take over the whole screen. Larry Hutcherson named this game Zipper, because you're zipping around the screen, and it's like you're doing up a zipper metaphorically, to control these areas. Zipper would have been a good name for this game. It evokes the right kind of mentality. But apparently, this is according to Hutcherson, apparently just about when they were going to go into manufacturing on this game, a lawnmower company released a lawnmower called the Zipper. Pete Kauffman got a little nervous about using that name and potentially running afoul of a larger company and trademarks and all of this. So he said that they had to do a new name. It couldn't be Zipper. According to Hutcherson, don't have Kauffman's side of this, who of course has passed on, they were sitting around at a table trying to think of a new name, and there was a pepper shaker on the table. And finally, Pete Kauffman just stared at the pepper shaker and said, "We're going to call it Pepper 2. Again, there is no Pepper 1. So it's called Pepper 2. Hooray. The other game, the bigger game of the two, Pepper 2 is kind of fondly remembered, but the one that was really the bigger hit that Hutcherson did in 1982 was Exidy's answer to Pac-Man called Mousetrap. Have you played Mousetrap either in the arcade or in one of its home conversions?
I played only the home version of the game.
Are you talking about the video game or are you talking about the Rube Goldberg board game? Because this has nothing to do with the board game Mousetrap.
I thought you were talking about the board game, but no, I haven't played it.
Mousetrap is basically a more strategic version of Pac-Man. It's a maze game. Just like Pac-Man, you're being chased around by things. You have to collect stuff while avoiding those things. But there are a series of gates within the maze of different colors. Blue, yellow, and red, and you had buttons on the control panel that you could use to open and close those gates in order to manipulate the maze to your advantage. This made the game more strategic by making you have to decide when was the best opportunity to use the gates, and also it meant that it wasn't a pure pattern game like Pac-Man, because even if the enemies had some patterns to them, the gates would completely destroy the patterns. The other thing they did that made it more strategic is just like Pac-Man's power pellet, you could collect dog bones that could be used to temporarily, because you're a mouse and you're being pursued by a dog, you could collect bones that would allow you to turn the tables and temporarily eliminate the dog. But you didn't use them right away. You actually collected these bones, and then there was a button you would press in order to activate it. So you could choose when to activate the ability. Then the other thing, because this was a point-chasing game, just like Pac-Man had its fruit and other stuff that you could move to the center of the maze to collect for additional points, there were a series of special items in Mousetrap as well. But instead of just appearing, unlike Pac-Man, where these things would just randomly appear in the center, there was a hierarchy of them, so only a couple of them would appear per level. And each time a new one appeared, it was worth more points than the one previously, and that would increase and increase. The first one was worth 200, and the 32nd, which was the highest, which was the last one, was worth 7,200 points. But the sequence reset if you died. So you would only get the largest point totals if you didn't die. So there were a lot more strategic considerations, tactical considerations in this game than Pac-Man, and it was also less pattern dependent. So it was a really interesting take on the maze genre.
This does look like a very interesting game. You have a maze, very much like Pac-Man, and you have different colored gates. 3 of them colored red, blue, and yellow. You have the cats running around all as the same color, but they seem to be moving around with similar AIs to how the ghosts in Pac-Man do.
Right, but with the gates there to break up any patterns. The gates break up patterns with the cats. I think I referred to a dog earlier. That was a mistake. Your mouse actually turns into a dog to chase the cats, is what I meant to say earlier.
Ah, there we are. I see the mouse turn into a dog there.
Yes.
Unlike Pac-Man, it looks like the pellets and power-ups are different colors than just being a different size. So the cheese is one color and the bone power-up is another color.
Mm-hmm. But again, you get to choose when to activate that ability. You collect bones that you use to activate the ability, but unlike the power pellets, which just you run over a pellet and immediately turns you, into a killing machine, in Pac-Man, you can collect the dog bones and choose when to use.
Yeah, when to use them, and it really adds an interesting dynamic to the strategy.
Right. So Mousetrap was a very interesting game. But this is kind of the high watermark, because, this is coming out in 1982, and 1982 is also the year that the market starts to fall apart. A small company like Exidy that is not well diversified is going to be particularly hard hit by that kind of thing. They had some other games that didn't do as well necessarily. They had a Defender clone called Victory that was not as big a hit. They had a real flop called Hard Hat. another maze game that did not do well. So by the end of the year, Exidy is definitely in decline. So this is a period when Exidy starts to move in a wide variety of directions just to kind of stay in the business. They do their first redemption game at the end of 1982, which is going to be the field that they move into full-time, essentially, after the video game thing starts falling apart, called Whirly Bucket, which is basically a take on skee-ball, but it's in a smaller cabinet. It's not a big skee-ball lane. It's in a smaller cabinet, more akin to a pinball. And then there's also this thing that spins around that can prevent you from, I think, getting your ball into one of the holes. It has some electronic sound and whatnot, borrowed from the video game era. So they do this game Whirly Bucket, trying to essentially bring skee-ball into other venues, I think, like arcades and bars, and not just in the Chuck E. Cheese's and boardwalks of the world where they have more room for this kind of thing. That game kind of does okay and kind of starts them down the road of, well, maybe this redemption game thing is what we should be doing. Though it's not the only thing they're trying in this time period. They also release a game in 1983 called Fax, F-A-X, which is a trivia game. There have been trivia games in the industry before, but, it's interesting, at the time they released the game in 83, Pete Kauffman is quoted in the trades as touting how this game can be placed in non-traditional venues like in hotels, and that it is also something that has an educational value. And so in this period of time when arcades are coming under attack and some communities are banning coin-operated video games, this he saw as something that they could be like, hey, this thing has educational value. It's a trivia game. This is the direction the industry's going, not this other violent, mindless stuff, so it's okay. But again, it's more about videos falling apart. We can't really compete in video to be one of the last companies standing, so where do we go? Well, we do a redemption game, Whirly Bucket. We do a trivia video game, Fax, that can go into non-traditional venues. In 1984, when the industry is really in the doldrums, they try to go a really cheap route by creating a system called Max-A-Flex, which is literally just an Atari 600 XL computer in a coin-op cabinet. It is literally just a home computer stuck in a coin-op cabinet. They contract with the company First Star Software to put 4 of their Atari 8-bit games, Astro Chase, Boulder Dash, Bristles, and Flip and Flop, into this Max-A-Flex system, with the promise of more games to come in the future. Boulder Dash is a really great computer game, a classic. And Astro Chase is a pretty good computer game too, but they are not made for the arcade environment. They have worse graphics because it's a home computer. They don't have the kind of frenetic gameplay that's been tuned for the arcade. All they do is stick a timer. I mean, they're the exact same games as the original Atari 8-bit games, except they stick a timer on them so that you do run out of time playing them eventually. Obviously, today, pretty much every coin-operated game is running on PC, standardized PC hardware. In a way, Pete Kauffman was thinking ahead of his time and being like, why should we be creating expensive coin-op hardware when computers exist? But on the other hand, an Atari 600 XL, it wasn't even an 800, it was a 600. An Atari 600 XL is not going to provide any kind of coin-op thrills and chills and spills that people are looking for. So this Max-A-Flex system that they did in 1984 was an abject failure. But again, this is the company trying to figure out how the heck do we stay in this business and what niches can we explore that nobody else is doing. So he tried exploring the very low end of the market, but nobody was doing this for a very good reason. It was a bad idea. There is one thing that they did do that was very successful in this period and did keep the company limping along with those minor hits just a little bit longer. 1983 was definitely a year where technology was seen as the savior of coin-op. The technology that most companies were pointing to as the savior of coin-op was the Laserdisc. Exidy did not get into Laserdiscs. At the time, they spun it as them taking the high ground. Pete Kauffman is quoted in the trades as saying, "We decided not to go with a Laserdisc specifically because of its drawback of the track-to-track access time. Solid-state digital has the advantage of total interaction." That's the high-minded technology argument they were making at the time. In interviews that some of these people have given more recently, they admitted that the reason they couldn't do Laserdisc is it takes a lot of artists to make all of the art and animation for Laserdisc games, and they did not have the art staff to be able to make a Laserdisc game. That's, I think, more the real reason based on what some Exidy people have said in more recent times. But they were trying to spin it at the time as being like, oh, access times, ah. Just like Nintendo really loved to spin access times with cartridge versus CD in the N64 and PlayStation. While they were concerned about the access times, that's true. The primary motivator was CDs were a lot easier to pirate, and they didn't want people pirating their games. We're giving this high-minded, it's about the load times thing, when really it's we can't afford the artists that would be needed to make a Laserdisc game. It was still a year where technology was seen as the future, and so Exidy did decide, while they were trying out all this other stuff, while they were trying out redemption games and trivia games and sticking 600 XL computers in arcade cabinets, they did decide to go all in on creating one really good system hardware that they could use to create games that were a little more cutting edge technologically than they had been releasing previously. So Howell Ivey created a new hardware in consultation with some of the programmers as well on Vic Tolome's team called the Exidy 440 hardware that was based around the Motorola 6809 processor. They put a lot of RAM in this thing, way more RAM than a lot of systems had at the time. It was at the full standard resolution of the time of 320 by 240, which was considered high resolution at that time. Obviously, laughable today, but at the time, and allowed them to do full bitmapped. With the additional RAM and everything, they could do full color screens, none of the stuff that they're doing before where there's just a little bit of primary color here, a little bit of solid color there. They could do full tableaus with this thing. They also went all in on sound. This was one of the first systems, the XD440, that could do full sound sampling. They could actually digitize real-world sounds and stick them into the game to make music and sound effects. The system had better graphics than they'd been able to do before. Not the best in the industry, but better than they'd been doing. Quite possibly, at the time it was released, the best sound in the industry. They had a separate 6809 in there, specifically driving the sound, and had some other custom sound chips as well that allowed them to use digitized sound effects and whatnot. Decided to go all in on light gun games using this new system. So they had it set up that you would use a light gun controller with them. So we did talk about this series of games a little bit when we did our light gun episode. With this hardware, their advanced hardware, they released a game called Crossbow in 1983. It was a light gun game where there's this character moving across the screen. As the character's moving across the screen, there are various enemies coming out to try to harm him, and you have to use your light gun, which is in the shape of a crossbow, literally, for this game, in order to shoot at all the enemies and the projectiles that are trying to prevent your guy from completing his mission in the game. This game was a really big hit. It was one of the bigger hits in this kind of fallow period of 83, 84, 85 in the arcades. I'm sure the sound was a big part of that because the sound was much more realistic than the sounds you found in most video games at the time because they were actual digital samples of real sounds. A new hire by the name of Ken Nicholson was the guy primarily responsible for all that kind of thing. To give an example of the kind of things that he would do, as he told Keith Smith in interviews for his book, he says, to get the sound of a skeleton exploding, I went to a bowling alley and recorded someone bowling a strike. I went to a duck pond to record ducks. Most of the sounds, though, were recorded right in Exidy's offices. The Amazon Warrior Princess death sound was a slowed-down version of one of our female co-workers' screams. The iconic "You Will Die" of the evil sorcerer in Crossbow was my voice speaking into a metal wastebasket. So he was actually creating sound samples, just like you would for a movie. He was doing Foley and other kind of stuff like that, just like you would do for a movie, and then digitizing these in this system. Obviously, we'll put Crossbow in the show notes, and it really does make for a remarkable soundscape compared to other games of the time, because it is not just bleeps and bloops, like so many of them are.
And it's not wireframe.
Right, because it's a more advanced hardware. Like I said, they can do full color, full screens now. Not necessarily the most impressive graphics in the industry, but at least much closer to what their competitors are doing now in terms of the graphics as well. So put that all together with the light gun control, which was kind of innovative. I mean, there have been target shooting games forever, but light guns being used in this specific way were kind of innovative at this time.
I don't know, this volcano thing where you got lightning in the background, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it's some good graphics. I mean, they went all in on this hardware. You know, when everyone else was going Laserdisc, they couldn't afford to do Laserdisc because they didn't have the artists, so they decided to go in a different direction and just make the most advanced hardware that they thought that they could sustain at the time. And that's the Exidy 440 board, and that's Crossbow, which was a big hit. Then they followed up Crossbow with a bunch of other games in the exact same vein, using the same hardware, using light guns, just changing the scenario. So Crossbow was medieval. Then in late 1984, they did Cheyenne, which was a Western-themed game, and was also somewhat of a hit as well. Then after Cheyenne, in 1985, they did a World War II-themed game called Combat. They're kind of pushing out these games. They're doing occasionally some other games as well, but the main thing that they're doing is these light gun games. They also experiment with some other things as well. They actually do one of the very first motion cabinet games, a game called Vertigo, where the cabinet actually swiveled around. Didn't use hydraulics to do it, used a pair of jack screws, apparently. They were trying to experiment with this cabinet motion thing that would soon sweep the industry. Strangely enough, that was a vector game, at a time when vector games were kind of no longer in vogue, let's say. And in fact, in 1986, they released a game called Top Gunner, which was the final vector game ever released by anybody in the arcades, and it did not do well. Everyone had long since gotten over vector by then. They were experimenting with some of these other things. They had the gun games, which were doing well, and then they were trying this stuff with the motion cabinets. They tried the Maxiflex thing. They continued to try some Redemption in there somewhere as well. But by 1985, they were in real trouble. The coin-op industry had kind of been in decline through 82, 83, was bottoming out in 84. It was starting to come out a little bit in 85, but it was still a rough year. And Exidy just hadn't hit on enough stuff that was exciting people. Both Crossbow and Cheyenne were hits, but by the time we got to Combat, the games were becoming very samey, and the gun games just weren't bringing in the same revenue anymore. Even Combat hit the very bottom of the charts, but it's clear that they were getting diminishing returns. Vertigo did not work at all. They sold barely any of them, and that was a very expensive flop because those cabinets were not easy to build. Obviously, the Maxiflex system didn't work out. That was a disaster. So in 1985, the company does actually enter Chapter 11 bankruptcy. At this point, they're getting kind of desperate because they're in bankruptcy, things are looking grim, they're getting diminishing returns on their flagship hardware, and they need to do something kind of big to get noticed again, just like in the old Death Race days, when they were a small company who no one knew about and they were getting buried by Chicago Coin and needed something that could, get attention to get them back on top. It just so happened that during this time period, I don't know if this was late 1985 or early 1986, but somewhere in there, Larry Hutcherson, the programmer of Mousetrap, whom we mentioned before, was working on an upgrade to the art tools that they use to draw the images in their game. Hutcherson was just drawing this picture of this Renaissance man chained to a wall and being tortured as kind of a test tableau, something a little cheeky as he's working on these improved art tools. Pete Kauffman comes by and sees this, and he says, according to Hutcherson, we have to make that game. That will be our next game. This is how we get the second most infamous Exidy game of all time, Chiller.
We talked about Chiller. That sounds familiar.
Yeah, because we did a light gun game episode. This is another in their light gun game series. They were all C games, following on from Crossbow, Cheyenne, and Combat comes Chiller. It's a horror-themed game. It's horror-themed because of this image that Hutcherson was drawing that kind of had a horror bent to it that he was not planning to turn into a game. That was all Kauffman. But according to Vic Tolomei, who programmed on this game as well, once they decided it was going to be a horror game like this, they decided that they would just go all out and make it as ridiculous and over the top as possible because, quite frankly, they needed the attention. I interviewed Hal Ivey, and he said that, part of the reason we did it was to be outrageous. They needed the attention because they were in bankruptcy now. They were in Chapter 11. They needed to be noticed at this juncture.
We either die doing something extremely crazy or just die quietly.
Exactly. So they made this thing just as shocking and revolting as they possibly could. Blowing off body parts and blood and gore. And there's some monsters and whatnot as well. It's not just all humans. There are several screens. The human torture wall is the most famous screen you always see on the internet. But there were other screens where you're shooting monsters and mummies and whatnot instead of people. But still, it gathered a lot of controversy and a lot of attention, and I don't know how successful it was, but it definitely got them some attention again, which is something they kind of needed at that juncture, and they were deliberately seeking. They did a few other things in 1986 as well. Hal Ivey actually modified the light gun game hardware so that it could scroll the screen because it was originally set up for single screen tableaus. It couldn't scroll. He made a modification to scroll the screen because Ken Nicholson really loved the game Spy Hunter and really wanted to do a game like Spy Hunter, but their hardware could not accommodate the scrolling. So Ivy did a modification that allowed that, and they released a game called Top Secret that was kind of like if Spy Hunter and Super Sprint had a baby. I don't think it was that particularly successful a game, but, you're shooting at enemies and grabbing power-ups and whatnot, kind of like Spy Hunter, but instead of just driving in a straight line forever, you're having to drive along twisty, curvy tracks out of something like an Atari racing game instead. So kind of weird, but they're starting to do things again. They do a game called Spin-a-Ball, which is a redemption game that, again, I think was trying to break into non-traditional venues because it had a tic-tac-toe game and a shuffleboard kind of game. Again, kind of casual games, probably trying to appeal to more of the bar market or that kind of thing again. They're, again, trying to latch on to whatever they can, and it's becoming more and more clear that they're kind of near the end of what they can do with their video game hardware. They're probably not going to do another video game hardware, really. Hal Ivey actually leaves the company in the middle of 1986 to go join Sega. And I asked him about that, and he said, the company had been in bankruptcy, and when you basically haven't been paid for a couple of years, you start looking for something else. So Hal Ivey left, depriving them of their hardware engineer. They did get out of Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1987, so I don't know if that was the Chiller effect or because games like Spin-a-Ball that were appealing to a more casual market did a little better for them. I don't know exactly how they got out of Chapter 11, but I just know they actually emerged from it after being in it for about 2 years. They come out the other side. They did release a couple more games using their gun game hardware. They did one called Hit and Miss in 1987, which I think was very deliberately the complete opposite of Chiller the year before, because it was a kiddie-themed game with no blood anywhere. So I think that was a very deliberate move in a different direction. Then they did one final mystery-themed gun game in 1988 called Whodunit. Not worth commenting on. We'll put it in the show notes, obviously, but it's the same as all of these others. They all have the same premise. There's a character walking around the screen, and you have to protect them by shooting things that are trying to kill them. And all that changes is the theme of the game. None of the later gun games were as successful as the earlier ones. By 1988, the hardware is really long in the tooth. Hal Ivey has left the company, so they've lost their hardware guru. Basically, by 1989, they're done with video games, and they move completely to redemption games, which are starting to become even more of a force in the arcade at the end of the 1980s. I certainly remember my local arcade in the 1980s, the Fun Factory in Hawaii. They had a lot of video games, and they had a lot of pinballs, but they also, I remember, had a giant redemption section in the back. All those games where it's just all about putting in a coin and doing something really fast to try to win tickets, something that just requires you to press a button once or whatever, just to try to win those tickets.
How lucky can you be?
Exactly. They did a bunch of those. They did one called Twister in 1989, where the player had to roll a ball to try to hit a moving target. That was one of their first successful ones. They did a bunch of others in the 90s, including one called Turbo Ticket, which was literally just a ticket-blowing machine where you stuck your arm through two circular openings and tried to grab the tickets that were swirling around. About the laziest form of redemption game you can possibly do. Just tickets blowing around.
That's where you need to have the sticky glove.
Exactly. I mean, those games, those redemption games that they did in the late 80s and early 90s, I mean, they were successful enough to keep them in business. As, again, just a moderately successful, not making huge profits, but making enough profits kind of company. Pete Kauffman had given up on having anyone else be in control of the company. In the early 80s, he had briefly hired a guy named Noah Anglin, who had been a manufacturing guy at Atari, to be president. That didn't last long. In 1985, he brought in Gene Lipkin, who had been the head of Atari Coin-Op, for a brief spell as president. That didn't last long. After that, he kind of gave up on giving up the day-to-day operation of the company. So it's, Pete Kauffman's still running it and doesn't want outside investment, is just content to make his tiny little profit. This continued until 1995 when, according to Pete Kauffman, who did say this in one of the interviews he gave but didn't go into details, that he had to close down the company after an employee embezzled over $300,000. Don't have details on what that embezzlement looked like, but for a company that was just barely hanging on and barely turning a profit, that embezzlement was just too much to come back from. And at that point in 1995, he finally shut the thing down.
Kind of a sad end. Disaster after disaster, some interesting things, desperate gambles, and really just puttering out at the end. Just to be taken out by embezzlement.
Exactly. Getting out of Chapter 11 in 1987 is pretty impressive. I mean, companies do emerge from bankruptcy sometimes, but it is not easy to emerge from Chapter 11 bankruptcy intact. And Exidy did. Probably because it was such a small operation, it didn't have a lot of investors and creditors. So that's probably what allowed Kauffman to just keep it going. But I think Kauffman was getting what he wanted out of it. I mean, obviously, it's sad that it had to end in embezzlement in 95, but I think overall Kauffman got what he wanted out of it. He just wanted something, a little piece of his own that could just putter along and make a small profit and allow him to live a reasonably comfortable life. And it did. Even after the company closed, he retained all the rights to everything. He did start a new company called Exidy without the E, Xidy. There's some confusion, and Keith's confused as well. Not sure if that company ever put out any redemption games after 1995 or if it was just a holding company for the assets. But either way, the final end of it was in 2006 when Pete Kauffman sold all of the rights to the catalog to a company called Mean Hamster Software, which allowed him to close the chapter. I assume that just allowed him to, have a retirement at that point. It's like, I've got this back catalog. It's not the most valuable back catalog in the world, but I'm not doing anything with it. So he sold the whole thing in 2006. It does just kind of putter out, but, it was never going to be a huge company, and that's the way Pete Kauffman wanted it. So this was the inevitable end. If you're not going to grow in a competitive business like this, then you are just going to putter out. It's kind of like Surtech when we did our Surtech episodes. That's another company that just kind of petered out because they were never interested for whatever reason in growing beyond the small amount of stuff they were doing, and eventually being small like that wasn't going to work anymore. And that's the same thing with Exidy, but I think that's the way Pete wanted it. So I don't know how sad we should be. I think he got what he wanted out of the company, more or less.
And we got some interesting, notable games out of it, and two of the big controversies of the 70s and 80s.
Exactly. So yeah, that is basically the company Exidy from start to finish.
From Ramtech to Exidy to just puttering out in an inglorious end.
Indeed.
Speaking of endings, we always have to have an ending with a new beginning. So in our next episode, how do we continue the tale?
Well, definitely not another company history, because we've now had 5 episodes in a row dedicated to company histories, which was not a bad thing, because it had been a while since we'd done a company history, so we kind of owed the people a few. That's good for now. I think it's time to look at a console that is not from one of the big console manufacturers. We've had a few requests over time to take a look at SNK's Neo Geo system. I think I have enough sources now that we can do a half-decent episode on the Neo Geo. Now, there aren't a lot of sources from inside SNK. This won't be like our recent Saturn episodes or something where we have a real insiders reveal all of what the heck is going on in the company as they make this system. But I've found enough sources that I think we can tell an interesting story of the Neo Geo. And if more information comes out later, we can always revisit the topic, just as we did with the Sega Saturn and have done with other topics as well. So a nice change of pace. We haven't done one of the more obscure, I don't know if it's fair to call it more obscure, but, a console not from one of the big manufacturers. It's been a while since we've done something like that, so that ought to be fun. Just do some Neo Geo.
So all you fans out there who want some Neo Geo, you're gonna get it next time on They Create Worlds. Check out our show notes at podcast.theycreateworlds.com, where we have links to some of the things that we discussed in this and other episodes. You can check out Alex's video game history blog at videogamehistorian.wordpress.com. Alex's book, They Create Worlds, the story of the people and companies that shaped the video game industry, Volume 1, can now be ordered through CRC Press and at major online retailers. Email us at feedback@theycreateworlds.com. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/theycreateworlds. Please help get the word out by leaving a review on your favorite podcasting service. We now have the podcast on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. Intro music is Airplane Mode by Josh Woodward, found at joshwoodward.com/song/airplane mode, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License. Outro music is Bacterial Love by Roll of Music, found at freemusicarchive.org, used under a Creative Commons Attribution License.